The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists.
It will be possible to change memory processes in human beings through the use of drugs and electrical stimulation.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Trinity Project. With this project, I hope to create interesting and informative videos with an entertaining and artistic edge. If you want more of an explanation, you can read my brief white paper in the description below. So, why start here exactly? Well, with the first episode, I thought it would be best to look into the history of cultural engineering. There are lots of other topics I'd like to get into, some that might even be more lucrative, but it's best we start off with something that we can look back on when exploring various elements of culture. For the sake of brevity, I won't include every possible example, and I'm not trying to conclusively prove my views right or wrong, just provide a vantage point for explaining the concept. Ultimately, you will have to decide what you find convincing and come up with your own perspective. I already know what your first question might be. What is cultural engineering? Before we can come to an answer, let's first establish what exactly engineering is. We can debate sources later, but let's start with Britannica, which states that engineering is the application of science to the optimum conversion of the resources of nature to the uses of humankind. Immediately, I take issue with this definition being already couched in humanist assumptions, but the application of science's element of this definition certainly presents a good starting point for analysis. I would say math, science, and even philosophy are all important to the makeup of engineering, and not just the social or cultural kind. How could one solve various engineering problems without a certain pattern of thoughts? And how can we say thought patterns are not influenced by philosophy? For example, an engineer might apply Occam's razor to judge unclear data, determining the most likely explanation. If we take it as a given that engineering is the application of science, we must account for the fact that the scientific method itself comes from philosophy, and that science was pushed forward by the ideas of various historical philosophers, such as Aristotle and Sir Francis Bacon, the latter of whom, you should know, Britannica labels as a philosopher. Thus, engineering is not an island, but deeply ingrained with history, culture, and philosophy. Revisiting that definition of engineering briefly, I thought a dictionary source might provide a less biased and more direct answer than that of an encyclopedia. As one might expect, however, Merriam-Webster says something similar to Britannica, which is that engineering is the application of science and mathematics by which the properties of matter and the sources of energy in nature are made useful to people. They also say that to engineer something is to contrive or plan out, usually with more or less subtle skill and craft, or also to guide the course of. So engineering involves planning by means of skill or craft, and it can also refer to guiding the path of something, like the engineer of a train would do. Just had to work that in there somewhere. The concept of engineering inevitably draws association with the rise of industrial society and the process of production and manufacturing. But some are also apt to ask, why would we limit the scope of engineering to mere machines and trinkets? Trust me, we're getting closer, but we must ask, what is culture? Going back to Britannica, they state culture as behavior peculiar to Homo sapiens, together with material objects used as an integral part of this behavior. Thus, culture includes language, ideas, beliefs, customs, codes, institutions, tools, techniques, works of art, rituals, and ceremonies, among other elements. We see here that there's a bias towards Darwinism and the modernist anthropology of cultural relativism, but much of what is said of the elements of culture are true, though not fully conclusive for sake of brevity. Merriam-Webster states culture is the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. As with the earlier definitions these two sources had for engineering, they both share commonality, but Merriam-Webster is more applicable to organizations, groups, and fields of study instead of a vague concept of humanity. However, we can also see another definition that culture can also mean to grow in a prepared medium, such as when studying bacteria, which could be an interesting view of what some may see themselves doing in the field of cultural engineering. Not exactly the best thought to have. Once again, I must reiterate that Britannica applies culture to all of humanity, while Merriam-Webster more practically admits that culture is most often segmented among specific groups who do not necessarily share the same exact culture just because they are all human. I will give a hint that unifying culture to create a, quote, world culture, eventually under a one world government or power structure, is a goal that cultural engineering often seems to seek after. If one has the power, or the desire for power within a society, one might ask if they could engineer culture to solidify or even achieve power. Could they guide it, plan its course, and shape its future by influencing language, waging war on what we think, changing the acceptable academic discourse, trying to change moral codes, gaining control over institutions, changing how one labors, steering the direction of arts and music, changing societal rituals, creating new holidays and celebrations, and even going as far as attempting to change the way people associate with race, religion, and social groups, and attempting to even consolidate groups and get rid of groups that cannot be controlled so as to gain greater overall control. This brings us to the most difficult part of what I'm discussing. Depending on your worldview, what we discuss here about cultural engineering will be either toxic or powerful, excessive or necessary, evil or altruism. However, even if one grants that engineering on the cultural stage could do some good and even defend the proper order of things, that does not justify what many or even most use cultural engineering for. One might even say that the very process of contemporary cultural engineering fosters a sort of selfishness and greed among those who wield it. Of course, everyone has heard the basic phrase, "power corrupts," and understands the issue at hand here. Often, the unfortunate end goals of contemporary cultural engineering are to devastate the general population's physical, mental, and spiritual faculties, and thus provide mere temporal benefits to the elite class who wield power in various forms, often in secret.